and they have a fantastic microphone, great setup, and I really appreciate that. So yeah, as Josh said, I often talk about the various peer-reviewed reports, and I'm happy to get into that. I will mention it a little bit, especially in questions and answers. I'm happy to get into that. But the main thing I want to talk about is what Josh was saying at the end. He asked me to talk today about the prodding effect, and basically, historically, how is it that we actually have gotten amendments? And so to do that, I'm going to tell you the history of America in a few different through a few different lenses. The flag that you see right there is is the Star Spangled Banner. It was the flag that flew during the battle in the War of 1812, and that really tells you something about the history of America is war. What is it good for? It turns out getting constitutional amendments. And if you go through our history, you can see the War of 1812, that is the White House burning down. And at that time, people were quite scared that that the British would give out titles of nobility, and that would lure people to join the other side. And that led to Congress proposing, that was one of the factors that led Congress to propose the Titles of Nobility Amendment. They proposed it before the war started, but it was the tensions that were leading to the war that was one of the triggers to cause that amendment to be proposed. Later during the Civil War, there were numerous amendment proposals, some of which passed, that came out of there. The first was the Corwin Amendment. During the tensions leading up to the war, really right as the war was starting, there was an effort to try to get an amendment to the Constitution that would preserve the status quo of slavery in order to make sure the war didn't actually end up happening. Fortunately, we did not end up with that status. Then at the end of the war, there was, of course, the 13th Amendment to end slavery. Shortly thereafter, there was the 14th Amendment for civil rights and the 15th Amendment for voting rights. And all of those were, in a large part, due to the Civil War and the tensions that it caused. During World War I, we saw a number of amendments again there. First, the enormous expenses that are related to the war meant that they needed to raise money, and so they needed the income tax amendment in the 16th Amendment in order to secure those taxes and get fight the war. Prohibition also came out of that. Some of the first prohibition laws in the country, or some of the first widespread ones anyway, were a result of rations for war. And that made the changes that were associated with the wartime effort made it a lot easier for prohibition to be accepted by a wider portion of the population, and lowered the threshold needed to make that amendment get actually proposed and ratified. Then there was women's suffrage, which also you can see in the picture there. Those are women working on the tanks. Women were absolutely crucial to the war effort. They were not allowed to go fight in the army, although there were many women who made military contributions as well. But on the home front, they were crucial in doing all of the jobs that the men that they had been excluded from before, and now were allowed to do because the men were off fighting in the war. And that helped launch, as did World War II later, that helped launch a wave of the women's movement that helped get women's suffrage over the finish line. And then during Vietnam, you can see the children, really, that were sent over there. And regardless of anyone's view, and of course the views on that war deeply, deeply divided Americans, but we were all kind of united that the 18, 19, 20-year-olds that were being sent over there, if they had the right to fight in the war, they also had a right to vote. And that led the 18-year-old voting amendment to be overwhelmingly popular and get that into the Constitution. So when you think about the prodding effect, one prod that has been used over and over again in the history of our country has been war. Um, I don't particularly like that prod. That's not really the way I want to go. So instead, let me tell you a different history of the United States. What you're seeing here in that picture is a freedmen's school shortly after the Civil War. It was for former enslaved black people to go to school, and that's in Memphis, Tennessee. And this was during a 3-day riot in which it was burned down. Sorry about that. And I read one newspaper account of that, and it blamed from the time period, the newspaper account actually blamed the black regiment from the Civil War for drinking too much alcohol and spurring on the racist attacks there. And during which I think it was 46 black people died and 3 white people, and just the way that was framed really hits home a lot about the state of the country that was going on. And that state of the country tells you how we handle things when we're under pressure. And amendments are an important way that that we fight back and come out of a lot of those things and make progress. Obviously, we didn't make all the progress we needed, but progress has been made. So the first real crisis that we've seen that led to a constitutional amendment was the election of 1800. We see there portraying Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. What happened in the election of 1800, the original Constitution, the way it was written, said that the electors would get 2 votes, and they didn't really foresee political parties. They just sort of thought that the one who got the most votes and the runner-up would become president and vice president, and that is kind of what's portrayed in the play Hamilton. That wasn't exactly what happened in reality. Hamilton takes a little bit of license there. In reality, Burr and Jefferson were running mates. They ran together, and they tied because they both got exactly the same electors to vote for them. They were trying to institute a scheme where one of the electors didn't vote for Burr so that Jefferson would get 1 more vote than Burr, and it didn't really work. So then they ended up with a tied vote, and it got sent to the House of Representatives, where then the opposition party, led largely by Hamilton, had a lot of control. And that's where you see the scene in Hamilton, if you're familiar with the play, where Hamilton chooses that Jefferson will be president and not Burr. Jefferson was always supposed to be the one who was president. Burr was his running mate. He was supposed to be the vice president. And it just revealed this utter flaw in the Constitution. And that crisis led to the quick adoption of the 12th Amendment, which created the electoral system we have today. Reconstruction, as I mentioned what's in the picture, here's another picture of similar events. And the Reconstruction era led to the 14th Amendment for civil rights. It also led to the 15th Amendment for voting rights. Because we saw after the Civil War, we ended slavery through that, but there was a lot of progress that was still, the black codes were being enacted, lynchings were prevalent, and they didn't stop at that point, but the civil rights and voting rights amendments did help set the stage for the laws that fought back against the KKK and did other things to help slowly pull us out of that era. Then we've also seen a number of terrible decisions by the Supreme Court. The ones here that caused the crisis that I want to focus on, it's not the ones that we usually talk about from terrible decisions from the Supreme Court. These are decisions of the Supreme Court where they were directly in conflict with Congress. Here, the Supreme Court interpreted state sovereignty, interpreted the Constitution as not giving states a sovereign right to defend themselves from being sued if they didn't want to. States basically have the authority. States have the authority to choose whether or not they want to allow people to sue them. And whatever you think of that, when the Supreme Court said they didn't, it didn't take very long for the powers that be to say, no, we actually do want that in the Constitution, and get the 11th Amendment through. We've seen similar things with the 16th Amendment and income taxes. Income taxes were fairly common leading up to a Supreme Court decision that said they were unconstitutional. They weren't around all the time, but they'd been instituted numerous times to pay for things like wars, like World War I, as I mentioned before. The income tax, the 16th Amendment happened before World War I, but it was during the military buildup that was leading to World War I. And so that increased spending was why it was particularly urgent at that time. And when the Supreme Court said you can't have an income tax, it didn't take long for Congress to propose one and for the state, an amendment to allow it and for states to ratify it. Another was child labor. By the time the child labor amendment was proposed, and you notice that one doesn't have a number next to it because it was never ratified, but the child labor amendment was proposed in the 20s. And by that time, Congress had quite a few robust child labor laws on the books. And I'll be talking a little bit more about how that happened in a bit. But the Supreme Court then came in and said, you know, these laws that you've been building and relying on, we're saying that those are no longer good. Congress ended up proposing the child labor amendment, and when it got within a few states away from being ratified, suddenly there was a new Supreme Court decision that reversed their old one and said, yes, child labor amendments actually are allowed. And if anyone happens to be concerned, I've noticed an uptick in news stories about child labor here in Massachusetts as well as in other places. There's been quite a few stories of people violating child labor laws, and in a lot of states loosening child labor laws. That amendment is actually still live and can still be ratified. It's only a few states away. Massachusetts is one of the states that has not ratified it, so if our state over here wants to take that up, that'd be great. One state legislator in Nebraska did recently push to try to get her state to ratify it as well, and I think that'd be a great thing to do. The next major crisis that I want to touch on is the Great Depression. Obviously, it was a monumental event in our history, and one of the problems that we noticed during the Great Depression, we had President Hoover was enormously unpopular because he was just simply utterly failing at any reasonable attempt to address the issue. They elected FDR, and the people really wanted him to step in and come start tackling the problem right away. And the delay from January to March to actually start the job was something that deeply frustrated people in that election. And that helped get that over the hump to get that amendment proposed and ratified. So that's why we have inauguration now in January instead of March like we used to have. You know, we no longer need to have to wait for the president to get to Washington by horse. And another thing that happened during the Great Depression was repeal of prohibition. And that happened for a number of reasons. One of them was we needed the tax revenue from alcohol sales. We also had an increasing number of desperate people who were becoming increasingly lawless during the start of the Depression. You know, that started in the 20s, but it took off and got even worse during the Depression. And people wanted to, you know, end that system that was creating these enormous problems. And it was only a few years into the Depression, the prohibition of alcohol was rescinded. And then the last crisis that I want to mention is dead presidents. We've had a few. That one there obviously is the famous photo of JFK. Josh was talking a little bit about him yesterday. When FDR died in office, that was one of the incidences that sparked the 2-term limit on the presidency. He had been president for basically the end of his life, served 3 and a little bit terms until he died in office. And that kind of freaked people out. And when he died during a major war in office, people thought maybe we should not have presidents for life. We should go back to the 2 terms that had been standard up until that point and put that into the Constitution. And then, of course, when JFK died, that sparked a rethinking of presidential succession and presidential incapacity, which was the 25th Amendment. We saw it when with the attempted assassination of Reagan a while after this, a couple of decades later. He was temporarily incapacitated after the attempted assassination, but he wasn't dead. And we needed to have Bush Sr. step in to serve temporarily as the acting president before Reagan was ready to come back and resume duties. And we've seen that used also. Bush Jr., when he had routine procedures, he temporarily stepped down from the presidency under the 25th Amendment. It just became utterly apparent of how necessary that was when JFK was assassinated. But again, the national crises are also not a prod that I particularly want to see happen. It does lead to amendments, but it's not necessarily ones that a way I want to go. This scene here, however, is from the movie Lincoln, and you can see President Lincoln there forcefully trying to get the members of the House of Representatives to propose the 13th Amendment to end slavery. And that is the next prompt that I want to talk about, is coming together and building coalitions. There's 2 types. The type depicted here, there's 2 types and a hybrid. The type depicted here is an insiders coalition. And we can see an example of that with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights had backers from all the top leaders in all the top states. They had just seen the Constitution ratified, and there were some things in it that they didn't like when they were in their conventions, state ratifying conventions, ratifying the U.S. Constitution. They found there was quite a bit about it that simply was not didn't meet their requirements and didn't meet their standards. A lot of those people went into the first Congress, and the ones who didn't were certainly very powerful. They were in the state legislature where they were choosing the senators, because before the 17th Amendment, that's how senators were chosen. And they had quite a bit of influence, and they were able to get James Madison to propose the Bill of Rights in the first Congress. Which is why it's what he wrote. State sovereignty. Now, again, I mentioned this one earlier. And you'll see that'll be a pattern. State sovereignty was something that the insiders absolutely wanted. It wasn't just a crisis that the Supreme Court decided that it's not something that they were expecting to have, and now they don't have it. In addition to being something they thought they would have, but now they don't have, also the people who they were taking that power away from were very, very much political insiders. They were the state leaders themselves. The member of Congress who proposed it was from Massachusetts, and that was because Massachusetts itself was facing a lawsuit that they thought was not appropriate under state sovereignty rules, and they wanted to prevent it. There were a lot of lawsuits relating to the Revolution and that whole early time period that they thought should not stand, and they needed that amendment to make that happen. And since they were politically connected, they were able to do it. The next one is vice presidential elections. You know, as Jefferson pointed out in that scene in Hamilton, you know, when Burr got chosen as his vice president, in the scene, which is not entirely historically accurate, in the scene he said, well, let's see if I could do something about that, because fortunately now I'm the president. Well, it was political insiders who were pretty influential in making sure that it was no longer your political rival who became your vice president, which did not happen with Burr and Jefferson. They were part of the same party. But with that party system, it ended up just creating that kind of weirdness where you could end up having um, your someone you didn't like as president and someone you didn't really intend to elect, and the political insiders who were basically choosing the president at that point. Um, they absolutely had a strong interest in changing that, especially with the party system in place. And then there are the Titles of Nobility Amendment. The picture you're looking at there, that is Napoleon Bonaparte's son, and that is his wife, who styled herself as the Duchess of Baltimore, accepting that title of nobility. And that kind of freaked people out over the influence that the French aristocracy was having over the political classes in America. Um, and that kind of combined with the increased tensions of the British aristocracy leading up to the War of 1812, to convince a lot of people that, maybe we should not have titles of nobility. And there was a proposal that if you accepted a title of nobility, you'd be stripped of citizenship. After the War of 1812 ended, and and a lot of the sentiments that were against it died down, that amendment never got ratified. But that's kind of what led to it, was the powers that be kind of being freaked out by these outside influences. And then here's the picture that I showed you earlier of Abraham Lincoln. The 13th Amendment seems like it would be a foregone conclusion at the end of the war, but it took a tremendous amount of effort from Lincoln to really ram that through Congress, through building coalitions and all kinds of tricks. The movie about it is pretty true to history, and I highly recommend watching Lincoln. It's if you're into this kind of stuff, which if you're watching this you are, then you will very much enjoy it. But yeah, it was not at all a foregone conclusion without an enormous amount of pushing to get that amendment through. And then there was the presidential inauguration. That there is FDR. He had just been elected president. He was enormously powerful. He was bringing with him an enormous supermajority from his own political party. The powers that be were very much in favor of changing the Constitution to help get the. I mean, it didn't affect his own inauguration, but they wanted his inauguration to happen sooner, and that helped encourage them to support an amendment that would make that kind of thing happen in the future. They didn't like having the lame duck last for so long, and they had when they were the ones in power, and so they were able to change that for the future. And similarly, the two-term limit. The opposition party then, the Republicans, did not like FDR staying in power for so long, and they slowly worked during his term to build additional power in order to propose a two-term limit. A lot of Democrats also did not like FDR becoming basically president for life. Even if they liked him, they didn't like the precedent that was setting, so they were kind of interested in going along with the two-term limit. And with his death, that made that a lot easier to do. And then there was DC voting rights, and that again was an insiders coalition. We think of Washington DC as a very blue area today. At the time that DC got the right to vote for president, it was actually pretty purple. I mean, the colors red, blue, and purple were not used the way they are until the 2000 election, so they wouldn't have used those terms. But it's what we would call at the time, it was what we would call today a purple district. And that made it a lot easier for the political insiders who worked and lived in Washington to force through a chance to get themselves a vote for president. And then it was similar with DC statehood. It was also proposed at that time when Washington, D.C. was a purple area. It did not end up getting ratified. D.C. was becoming bluer and bluer, and it had a lot of red opposition. And it did not end up getting ratified as an amendment to the Constitution. It expired. But the proposal was a similar effort. And then there was the poll tax. Now this one is a little bit surprising. Notice you don't see in that picture of the signing of the poll tax, you don't see any of the leaders of the civil rights movement. they were not actually in favor of an amendment to get rid of poll taxes. They were in favor of legislation to get rid of poll taxes. The civil rights effort had enormous success in the period leading up to that, in getting the Civil Rights Act, getting the Voting Rights Act, getting things through the Supreme Court as well that helped end a lot of the segregation and Jim Crow era. And they wanted to do the same method for poll taxes. They did not think they needed an amendment to the Constitution to do it. They believed in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. You'd be able to just write ordinary congressional legislation to get rid of a poll tax. And they believed that an amendment to the Constitution would kind of set that as the threshold and make it so that it would be a lot harder to get additional legislation through. And that is, to a large extent, what ended up happening. So the amendment got pushed through mainly from political insiders who were going through it, who were going for it, and not so much the activists on the ground. And then there's presidential succession. That there is John Feerick. He was the dean of Fordham Law School for 20 years. Stepped down from that position about 3 years before I went to Fordham Law School. I interviewed him for our documentary, and he was a fantastic guy. He wrote, well, he was the lead author. There were many people. He likes to downplay his own role in it. But he was the lead author in the American Bar Association report on Article 5. One of the top experts in the world on the Article 5 convention process. But here's the thing is, when you write an amendment to the Constitution and you are one of the few, if maybe only, living person who has written a current amendment to the Constitution, you can't get that guy not to talk about that. And I appreciate it, and it's great. And when I interviewed him about Article 5, a few times he made sure to talk about the 25th Amendment, and that was a lot of fun. He was a young, fresh out of law school, and he wrote a paper on the need for a presidential succession law, amendment rather. And he wrote a model amendment, and he was connected with the American Bar Association. They were connected with Congress. They kind of had all of those political insider pieces in play. And then when John F. Kennedy died, suddenly he got a call from Senator Birch Bayh, who was the leader of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the U.S. Senate and the Senate Judiciary Committee. And they had all the pieces in place, needed all the political insider pieces in place to push that amendment through. So let's talk about another kind of coalition. You're going to hear a lot more about the National Organization, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. I love everything about that organization except their incredibly clunky name. Although there have been plenty of people who've criticized our name as well. Pauline Sabin and the other people who worked with her launching a political rally, and you're going to hear a lot more about that when John speaks, and I'm really looking forward to that talk myself. So again, coming together, this time using outsiders coalitions. This is the film Newsies, now a Broadway musical as well, and it depicts the real newsboy strike that was part of the labor movement. That's kind of a happier picture to depict. I could have done the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, in which many little girls died. There was a similar horrible incident with the Matchstick Girls in England that was recently fictionalized in Enola Holmes. The children were, you've seen, my kids saw it in an American Girl movie. Children were working, their fingers were getting cut off from the machines they were working on. They weren't going to school. And a movement started of political outsiders to try to push to change that. And they worked for a very long time, for decades, in order to make that into the political insiders coalition that eventually, in order to get legislation through Congress that changed that changed child labor laws. Those were the laws that eventually got overturned by the Supreme Court, and by that time it had become an insiders coalition, where the Supreme Court had overturned something Congress had done, and then Congress wanted to change it back, backed by this outsider coalition with them. Then there was a prohibition. That there, if you're not familiar, is I'm blanking on her name. Why am I blanking on her name? She's got a great name. I will come back to it. Sammy's Googling it for me. Google Prohibition Hatchet. Carrie Nation. I remembered before you got it.
You got it. Yeah.
That is Carrie Nation. She would go around during the late 1800s with her hatchet, go town to town, go to the saloon, and destroy the place. Josh mentioned a connection between the women's rights movement and prohibition. This was kind of the early roots of that connection. The problem that they were seeing was that she and many others saw their husbands going out to the saloon. Women were not allowed in the saloon at the time. And they were getting drunk, and they were coming home, and there was a tremendous amount of domestic violence and other problems, poverty, and a number of other things caused by prohibition. And they actually built a coalition of a number of groups, from the NAACP to the KKK, that everybody kind of didn't like what happened when other people in other groups drank. And that helped then build a very large coalition of people who really absolutely did not see eye to eye on anything else, but it helped lead to the 18th Amendment to get prohibition of alcohol. And then the repeal of prohibition, Pauline Sabin and the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. Once we had prohibition, it was no longer an issue that women weren't allowed in saloons. No one was allowed in saloons. And instead they had speakeasies, and women went in there illegally just as much as men did. So that changed quite a bit about the culture at that point. People found the problems that they had been expecting to be solved by prohibition. Many of them just got worse. The government was literally poisoning alcohol. People were dying because they were drinking illegal alcohol that had been literally poisoned by the government. Meanwhile, companies were selling grape juice mixtures with instructions that said, warning, do not store under the cabinet in these conditions for this length of time, or you might accidentally make wine. So it wasn't terribly effective either. Pauline Sabin, I'm not going to go too much into her because we're about to have a talk that goes all about it. But she went all around the country building up that coalition of all the people from all different walks of life who needed to see that change. And in addition to the Great Depression, I'd say second only to the Great Depression, maybe even first above the Great Depression, they were what led the movement from its lowest point in its history in 1928 to passing the amendment in 1933, only 5 years later. And that's why we modeled a lot of our rebuild after their work. Then there's 18-year-old voting. At the same time that the Vietnam War was going on overseas, there were a lot of kids over here getting incredibly politically active. In a lot of ways because of the war, and then in a lot of other ways for other things too. And they rallied around quite a few political movements, and one of them was to make sure that they and their friends could actually get their voices heard. They saw themselves either being shipped off to war against their will, or seeing their loved ones being shipped off to war, or going to hiding and leaving the country, or going to jail to avoid that if they were opposed to the war. And they had no say in it. And they launched enormous rallies around the country to help push that amendment through. And then there's coalitions that are kind of a mix of both. And we saw that with the 17th Amendment. This was led in a large part by the voters of the states who were frustrated with the enormous amount of corruption, and then they worked through the states, and the states did a number of things in order to try to change the system. One of the things that they did, I'm going to talk about the one that I'm sure all of you are thinking about in a minute, but separately from that, they also had systems where they did straw voting with laws that were that would say whoever won the straw vote should then get appointed to the Senate by the state legislature. I should back up and just make sure everyone knows what happened with the 17th Amendment, actually. So at that time, before the 17th Amendment, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. They weren't chosen by the voters. And that led to a situation where it was enormously partisan and enormously corrupt. There was rampant bribery. There were often vacancies in the Senate. It was known as the Millionaires Club, and this was the Millionaires Club in the 19th century. I'm not even sure with inflation how much that is today, but it's probably pretty similar to the situation we see in the Senate today, quite frankly. I think because of the corruption and Citizens United and other cases, we're seeing a pretty similar situation in the Senate and in the House as well today as we saw then. And at that time, people talked to their state legislators, who were much closer to the people. The state legislatures, in addition to passing calls for an Article 5 convention, they also created state coalitions or state committees rather on trying to see this amendment get through. We had a similar committee created here in Massachusetts a few years ago that I worked with a lot, the Massachusetts Citizens Commission, working on Citizens United overturning and that amendment. We saw the same thing happen there. And because of a lot of the political activism that was going on, we saw an increase in the number of senators in Congress who had either won a straw vote and were the choice of the people, or were otherwise chosen because they were the kind of people who people were supportive of. And that led to a softening of the Senate and an increase in their willingness to then propose the 17th Amendment before the final push, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you see on the left there, that is a young Alice Paul. She had been radicalized in the British women's suffrage movement and then helped become one of the leaders in the American women's suffrage movement, bringing a tremendous background in rallies, in effective civil resistance, and rallies that really prevented the powerful from being able to do anything but agree with them. And there's a book called Civil Resistance, What Everyone Should Know, by Erica Chenoweth that I highly recommend everyone read. Civil resistance is not easy, and she was well trained in it and knew how to do it, and helped build that kind of outsiders coalition that helped see women's suffrage get proposed and get ratified when they didn't even have the right to vote up until that point. And then on the right, you can see Alice Paul as well, as 50 years later. Once women's suffrage, the amendment passed, they kind of built up a lot of insider power. They still had quite a bit, they still had a broad grassroots coalition that they were working with, but increasingly they were working inside the halls of Congress. And they were able to then get the Equal Rights Amendment proposed using a lot of that insider power. And while they still had coalitions and support, they did not have as much coalition and support for the Equal Rights Amendment as they had with the groundswell that they had created for women's suffrage. And as a result, when Phyllis Schlafly came along and built that kind of grassroots support on the opposite side, fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment, she was able to turn the tide and cause the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. And Phyllis Schlafly's group is called the Eagle Forum, which some of you know because some of you have seen them testifying against us in various state legislatures. After they defeated the Equal Rights Amendment, they went on to to basically push back against any kind of effort to amend the U.S. Constitution, and they became one of the most vocal opponents of the Article 5 Convention process, spreading really outright lies about a lot of the history of it. More so, them and the John Birch Society and Common Cause are probably the three biggest. Common Cause on the left, John Birch Society and Equal Rights Amendment on the right are the groups that are the three biggest ones in spreading falsehoods that other people end up believing on this process. We can see there the U.S. Constitution, Article 5 itself, of course, and that brings us to, the strategy that we actually have been pushing for the last 12 years almost now. And that is the states taking the lead. And it was the founders' method. That right there is the Article 5 Convention call from the state of New York, 1789. It was done in response to the unanimous circular letter from the New York State ratifying convention that called for the use of the Article 5 Convention process to get the Bill of Rights. New York and Virginia called for that convention. Hamilton, the letter was written by John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Alexander Hamilton was one of the people who helped him with that, helped him write it and helped push for it, and voted for it as well in that convention. And he ended up being one of the big advocates who said that we should parry the zeal for amendments by proposing them rather than by fighting against it. And that helped pioneer the idea that this method can be a prod to get the amendments that we need. And we saw through that the Bill of Rights, which included the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. It also included what is now the 27th Amendment. That amendment was originally the Second Amendment. The Bill of Rights included 12 amendments at first. The ones that passed right away, that we now call the Bill of Rights, were amendments number 3 through 12. The original Second Amendment was congressional pay. And that got ratified largely because there was a young guy in Texas who wrote a paper that said we should ratify that amendment. And then he went around to all the states and said, this amendment has been on the books for, at that point, over 180 years, over 200 by the time it was actually ratified. And he spent about 14 years going around the states and convincing people that members of Congress should not be able to vote themselves a pay raise, and that they had already proposed an amendment to prevent it. We just needed to ratify it. And 200 years after it was proposed, we finally did. The original First Amendment was apportionment. That one is not so relevant now. It used a formula to set how many members there should be in Congress, and the formula made a lot of sense. It kind of calculated a range, and the range that it calculated made a lot of sense when our country was small in population. And then as it grew, the range ended up being we had to have more than like a few dozen and less than a few thousand, which means it's just kind of irrelevant if it gets ratified now. So it's still out there, it could get ratified, but it wouldn't really do much if it got ratified today. Then representing the people. This was mentioned yesterday, actually. Josh mentioned this as well. This is the Nebraska resolution calling for an Article 5 convention in 1893 for direct election of senators. They were the first ones in 1893, but they didn't really have a coalition behind them. It really built up steam when the coalition formed, starting with Pennsylvania and then a few other states following suit right at the same time in 1901, where the state legislators started communicating with each other to call for that amendment. That coordinated effort with the different states helped get us to the point where we were one or two states shy, depending on how you count, of having enough resolutions to get a convention to the Constitution. And that combined with the other efforts that were going on at the same time to try to soften the hearts of the Senate to make them more likely to be willing to pass it. That ended up prodding them to say, well, we don't want to have the states, take this away from us and have the states be the ones who get all the credit for proposing it. We want to be the ones who propose it ourselves. And that's what they ended up doing. So they ended up proposing the 17th Amendment, and the Senate ended up agreeing to changing the way the Senate itself got elected. Then there were some other efforts where the Article 5 convention method played a smaller role. This one here, I believe, is that Kentucky? Indiana. That one's Indiana. That was their call for the Corwin Amendment, which I had mentioned earlier. The states were kind of freaking out when the Civil War was starting, not surprisingly. And a number of states proposed an Article 5 convention. Some of them specified the Crittenden Amendment, which is very similar to the Corwin Amendment, as something that would be an acceptable proposal. Others talked generally about the Civil War. Others called for an open convention, just to try to make sure the states all met to talk about whatever they could come up with. It was too little too late. The Civil War was already starting at the time that the states were passing this. And so there was no meeting of the states with the power to propose a change that could actually make the change happen. Then this one didn't have much effect, but I admire the effort. This is a resolution from Oregon. Now, I mentioned before where Lincoln had to really push and prod the House of Representatives to propose the 13th Amendment to end slavery. And seeing that the Senate had already proposed it, and seeing the time limit running out for the House, Oregon said they should see if they can call for a convention to propose the amendment instead. It didn't have much effect because they were the only ones, and Lincoln's efforts were already underway. As far as I've been able to tell, Oregon's efforts didn't impact what was going on in Washington. But I have a feeling that if it had failed in Washington, Oregon's idea would have caught on, and we probably would have gotten a pretty major push for that amendment using the Article 5 convention method instead. Then it's the two-term limit. Again, it didn't have a major role. It was during a period where a number of amendments were being proposed. A number of convention efforts were being proposed, and there were a number that came out for the two-term limit in between FDR dying and the amendment actually being proposed. People were kind of getting frustrated that it took several years for Congress to act when it was so obvious that they should, and expected that they would act and propose the two-term limit. And about 6 or 7 states passed convention calls calling for it. I don't know the degree to which that had any impact on the ultimate vote. I don't have much reason to think that it had a major impact on the vote in Congress, but that is something that no matter how much time you spend studying this stuff, there are always more questions. It might be that had a more significant impact, but as far as I'm aware, that did not have much of an impact on the two-term limit. But it was an effort that involved several states. And then prohibition repeal. This one, it didn't have much of an impact, but it was fascinating. There was an effort by a congressman in New York, Louis A. Cavalier. I have found very little information on him, but I found some primary sources, and I would love to know more. He wasn't significant enough to have his own archives. But I have looked through some archives and found some primary sources and some contemporary newspaper articles. He, along with a woman whose name I can't remember, also from New York, were kind of the ringleaders in pushing for an amendment to repeal prohibition using the Article 5 convention method. Now, they had a strategy that does not actually work. It's unconstitutional. They wanted to combine their few convention calls on prohibition reform with convention calls on other topics. That was one of the things that helped lead to people making up statements about the Article 5 Convention, and one of the early things that led to some of the backlash against this process. Wayne Wheeler, who ran the Anti-Saloon League, he was probably the most legendary propagandist in American history. He was one of the first to use terms like Pandora's box and push for a lot of the lies that we still see today on the convention effort. There were a few things written before him, and it really took off with a bigger effort in the 60s and then a much bigger effort in the 80s. But that was in the early development of a lot of the anti-convention stuff. But I did find one, the woman who was, and I wish I could remember her name, but the woman who was working with Cavelier, she had a lot of kooky ideas about that were, I think, a little too, let's say, sexually liberating for the time period that she openly repeated in Congress. And that led to people like Pauline Sabin, who were trying to create a coalition that was very broad with all Americans to kind of push her and her effort to the side. But I haven't found enough about that to really state anything with too much certainty. But I did find one story in the New York Times about when this resolution passed in New York, the resolution you're seeing there. It was when it passed the Assembly in New York. The session before this one was when it finally passed both the Assembly and the Senate. But a year before, when it passed the Assembly for the first time, Cavelier got a standing ovation in the New York State Assembly. And I can, even though I can't actually see Josh, I can kind of picture the look on his face, because he is one of very few people who's experienced what that feels like. When our resolution got a standing ovation when it passed in Rhode Island. And it was kind of cool to read a story about the same thing happening like 80 years earlier on a similar effort. So you may have noticed I mentioned almost every amendment twice. And there's a reason for that. You can't really amend the Constitution using only one prod. There's a few exceptions, and you'll see that they were either smaller amendments or smaller efforts, ones that maybe didn't age as well. You see the 23rd Amendment, 24th Amendment, the ERA, which I personally support very much, but it didn't end up in the Constitution. Same with DC statehood, which I also personally support, but again, it did not have the power to get ratified. And those ones were done really just by organizing. Everything else we can see had at least two major efforts pushing for it that helped get it over the hump. We can see the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments, that's for civil rights, voting rights, and income tax. There was a combination of a war and also a major crisis, with the Supreme Court Amendment combined with the World War I, or with the Civil War combined with Reconstruction. We can see titles of nobility along with 13th, 18th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. Both had a major organizing effort behind them, either insider or outsider coalitions, and they also had a war that helped spur them on. The Corwin Amendment was the one effort where you could see an Article 5 convention call was combined with a war. And that did help get that proposed ultimately by Congress. The Corwin Amendment was proposed by Congress, even though they were still pretty far from a convention, and it didn't go anywhere, obviously, because of the war itself, made it essentially obsolete. There was the Child Labor Amendment, along with the 11th Amendment of State Sovereignty. 12th Amendment is vice presidential elections, and then we had 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd. Those all had major organizing efforts as well as a major crisis spurring them on. But frankly, I don't really want a war, and I don't really want a major crisis. And that leaves us with two prods left. And if we're going to need two prods, as every amendment that's been effective really has, then we're going to need both of those. And that means we're going to need the organizing effort, and we're going to need a convention strategy. And that combination is what got us the Bill of Rights, which included the first 10 amendments, as well as the 27th Amendment, and the Apportionment Amendment, which was also proposed, but obviously is irrelevant now. And it's also what got us to the 17th Amendment. And that's why that's been the strategy that we've been going with. And so Josh did say I'd talk a little bit about the peer-reviewed reports. That's really the end of